Chapter 6. The Sanctuary of Echoes. The group stood at the edge of the forest, staring at the massive, distorted structure that loomed before them. The Sanctuary of Echoes was unlike anything they had encountered in Alo, or any game world, for that matter. Its jagged walls shimmered with cascading lines of code, flickering and glitching like a hologram on the verge of collapse. At times, the structure seemed solid, almost ancient, with towering spires and intricate carvings that looked as if they belonged in a forgotten temple. But in the next moment, the reality of it warped. Sections of the walls would dissolve into floating pixels before snapping back into place, as though the sanctuary itself couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Eerie whispers drifted out from its depths, a cacophony of distorted voices that sounded half human and half machine. They were faint, but they seemed to come from all around them, as if the air itself was alive with the sound. The effect was unnerving, like the sanctuary was trying to pull them in, or warn them to stay away. Kirito felt a shiver run down his spine. He gritted his teeth, trying to push down the growing sense of unease that had been clawing at him since they arrived. "Well," Klein said, breaking the silence as he adjusted the katana strapped across his back. "This doesn't look ominous at all." His voice was light, but there was an edge of nervousness to it. "Are we sure this is a dungeon and not some kind of haunted house event? Because I'm pretty sure I signed up for a fantasy MMO, not a survival horror game." Sinan rolled her eyes, shifting the sniper rifle slung over her shoulder. "Focus, Klein. Whatever's in there is responsible for..." She paused, gesturing vaguely toward Kirito. "For this." Kirito frowned, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "Stop pointing at me like I'm the problem," he muttered, his voice tight with irritation. The sound of his own voice still caught him off guard. It was soft, higher-pitched, and carried the same gentle cadence as Asuna. No matter how many times he spoke, it still didn't feel like his. Sinan smirked, tilting her head slightly. "Technically, you are the problem. Or, more accurately," she pointed a finger at him, her tone teasing. "You're the symptom." Kirito's glare darkened, his cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "Can we not do this right now?" He shot back, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of his frustration. That only made Sinan's smirk widen. "Ah, you even sound like her when you're annoyed." "Sinan," Asuna said sharply, stepping between them. Her tone wasn't angry, but it carried enough weight to make Sinan raise her hands in mock surrender. "Enough." Asuna turned her attention to Kirito, her expression softening. "Don't let her get to you," she said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We're all on edge right now." Kirito sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly under her touch. "I know," he said quietly. "It's just..." He trailed off, unable to find the right words. How could he explain what it felt like? To look in the mirror and see someone else staring back? To feel his own body betraying him, step by step, piece by piece? He glanced down at himself, at the slender frame that no longer felt like his own. Even his equipment had changed. His beloved elucidator and dark repulsor were gone, replaced by one of Asuna's rapiers. The weapon felt foreign in his hand, its balance all wrong. He hated it. Hated how it all felt. "This isn't me," he muttered under his breath, clenching his fists so tightly his nails dug into his palms. Asuna's grip on his shoulder tightened slightly, as if sensing the storm brewing inside him. "We'll figure this out, Kirito," she said, her voice firm but soothing. "I promise." Her words helped, if only a little. Kirito nodded, though the tension in his body didn't ease. "Let's just get this over with," he said, his voice low but steady. Klein took a cautious step forward, peering at the sanctuary's flickering walls. So, anyone else getting the feeling that this place doesn't exactly want us here? It's a rogue eye's base of operations, Sinon replied, her tone matter-of-fact. I doubt it's going to roll out the welcome mat. Great, Klein muttered. Just once, I'd like to go on an adventure where things don't feel like they're about to kill us. Agil chuckled, his deep voice breaking some of the tension. Where's the fun in that? Kirito ignored their banter, his focus locked on the sanctuary ahead. The whispers were louder now, a low, distorted murmur that seemed to resonate in his chest. He couldn't pick out the words, but there was something about them that felt familiar. Does anyone else hear that? He asked, his voice cutting through the conversation. The group fell silent, listening intently. I hear it, Asuna said after a moment, her brow furrowing. It's like voices, but they're all jumbled. It's the AI, Sinon said. She unslung her rifle, gripping it tightly, as her eyes scanned the area. It's probably trying to mess with us. Or warn us, Agil said quietly, his gaze thoughtful. Klein snorted. Oh, I yeah, because evil AIs are so well known for giving helpful advice. Kirito didn't respond. The whispers were growing louder, filling his ears like a rising tide. For a moment, he swore he could make out his own name, spoken in a voice that was eerily similar to Asuna's. Kirito? He froze, his blood running cold. The voice was faint, almost drowned out by the other whispers, but it was unmistakable. Kirito? You okay? Asuna asked, noticing the way he had gone rigid. Aye. He shook his head, trying to clear the sound from his mind. It's nothing. Let's keep moving. The group exchanged uneasy glances, but didn't press him. Together they approached the sanctuary's entrance, a massive archway carved into the shimmering walls. Strange runes glowed faintly along its edges, pulsating with a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. As they stepped closer, the whispers grew into a chorus, their distorted voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. The air felt heavy, charged with an unnatural energy that made Kirito's skin crawl. Well? Klein said, his voice strained. Guess this is it. Kirito tightened his grip on the rapier at his side, his jaw set. Stay close, he said, his voice steady despite the unease churning inside him. As the group crossed the threshold, the world around them seemed to shift. The air grew colder, darker, and the whispers became deafening. Kirito took a deep breath, forcing himself to keep moving. Whatever was waiting for them inside, he knew one thing for certain: there was no turning back now. The group stepped into the sanctuary of echoes, and the world seemed to shift around them. The air was dense, heavy with a strange, static-like energy that hummed against their skin. It wasn't just the temperature. It was something deeper, something wrong. The atmosphere pressed against them like an invisible force, worming its way into their thoughts, amplifying their unease. The walls around them shimmered with translucent layers of flickering code, each vein of data pulsing erratically, as if the sanctuary itself was alive. The lines of code weren't clean or orderly. They were fragmented, broken in places, looping endlessly in others. Occasionally, the walls seemed to ripple, distorting their reflections like a warped mirror. Whispers echoed faintly through the chamber, low and fragmented, as if 1,000 voices were speaking at once, but none of them could be understood. The words came and went, overlapping and fading, just on the edge of comprehension. Data integrity compromised. Preservation protocol engaged. Klein repeated one of the whispers, his brow furrowing as he looked around nervously. What does that even mean? It's the AA, Agil said, his deep voice steady but grim. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the strange alien architecture. It's speaking in fragments. These walls, this whole place, it's not just a dungeon. It's a part of its programming. We're inside its core. Kirito's hand instinctively went to the hilt of his sword. The weapon felt unfamiliar in his grip. Lighter, thinner than the blades he was used to wielding. It was another reminder of the changes he couldn't escape. His eyes flicked downward, taking in his avatar once again. The slender arms, the delicate fingers, the long legs that moved with a grace that wasn't his own. Even the white and red armor he wore hugged his now curvy frame in a way that felt alien. He gritted his teeth, his jaw tightening. This isn't me, he thought. It didn't matter how many times he told himself that. It didn't change the reality staring back at him. Behind him, Sinun's sharp voice broke the oppressive silence. This place feels wrong. She had her sniper rifle at the ready, her posture tense, her sharp blue eyes scanning every flickering shadow. Like it's waiting for us to make a mistake. Stay sharp, Asuna said, her tone commanding but calm. She moved to the front of the group, her rapier held loosely in her hand. If this AI is powerful enough to rewrite Kirito's data, there's no telling what else it's capable of. Kirito glanced at her, his gaze lingering for a moment. Asuna always had this way of taking charge, of steadying the group, when things felt like they were spiraling out of control. He envied her calm, her confidence. But he couldn't dwell on it. Not now. As if on cue, the space ahead of them rippled, the shimmering code on the walls flaring briefly before dimming again. The whispers grew louder, their fragmented sentences overlapping into a distorted cacophony. Then, the air in front of them seemed to tear open, glitching like a broken screen. Figures began to emerge, humanoid shapes pulling themselves out of the wall. At first, they were little more than shadows, their forms flickering and unstable. But, as they stepped fully into the chamber, their features became clearer. Kirito's breath caught in his throat. "They're players," Sinon said, narrowing her eyes as she raised her rifle. Her voice was steady, but there was a note of unease in it. Or at least, they were. The figures were avatars, unmistakably so. But they were wrong. Their bodies were warped, their limbs too long or too short, their movements jerky and unnatural. Their faces were even worse, features half-formed, eyes glowing with a cold, empty light. They looked like corrupted files brought to life, broken fragments of what they once were. Agil gripped his massive axe tightly, his expression grim. "They're corrupted," he said, his voice low. "The AI must have absorbed their data and twisted it into whatever this is." "Great," Klein muttered, drawing his katana. He tried to keep his tone light, but the nervous edge in his voice was clear. "Zombie players. Just what I needed today." One of the corrupted figures lurched forward, its movements uneven and mechanical, like a puppet on tangled strings. Its head twitched to the side, at an unnatural angle, and a distorted, static-laden voice escaped its lips. "Can't stop. Preserve. Data." Kirito felt a chill run down his spine. The voice was hollow, broken, but there was something hauntingly human about it. He glanced at Asuna, who was staring at the figures with wide eyes. "These were real players," Kirito said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The thought made his stomach turn. "The I It didn't just corrupt their avatars, it's using them. Is there a chance they're still alive? Asuna asked, her voice trembling slightly. Agil shook his head grimly. Not likely. If their data's been absorbed into the IS system, there's not much left of them to save. Then, we put them out of their misery, Sinon said coldly, her sniper rifle already aimed at the closest figure. Wait, Kirito said sharply, holding up a hand. He stepped forward, his eyes locked on the corrupted player in front of him. Ah! Its glowing eyes flickered as it tilted its head, watching him. Kirito, what are you doing? Asuna asked, her tone laced with concern. He hesitated, his grip tightening on his sword. I need to know if they're still in there. The corrupted figure took another step forward, its broken voice crackling like static. Save her. Don't let it take. Kirito froze. His heart was pounding in his chest. There was no doubt. The voice belonged to a player. Whoever this was, they were still in there, trapped in some twisted, half-alive state. Kirito, get back. Sinon snapped, her finger hovering over the trigger. But before he could move, the figure lunged forward with a screech, its jerky movements suddenly fast and vicious. Kirito barely had time to react, his body moving on instinct as he drew his sword and deflected the attack. The weight of the rapier still felt wrong in his hand, but it was enough. The corrupted player staggered back, its movements glitching, as if it were buffering. Kirito, are you okay? Asuna called, rushing to his side. I'm fine, he said, though his heart was still racing. He looked at the figure, his mind racing. They're still in there. But how do we stop this? How do we save them? Kirito, Agil said, his voice grim. You saw what it just did. Whatever's left of them, it's not enough. We can't save them. We don't know that, Kirito argued, his fists tightening. We don't have time to find out, Sinon said firmly. If we hesitate, they'll kill us. The other corrupted figures began to move, their glowing eyes locking onto the group. Their jagged, unnatural movements became more coordinated as they closed in, forming a loose circle around them. Looks like we don't get a choice, Klein muttered, raising his katana. Guess it's time for some zombie slaying. Kirito hesitated, his sword trembling in his hand. He didn't want to fight them, not if there was even a chance they could be saved. But the look in their glowing eyes was empty, hollow. Whatever humanity they had left was buried too deep for him to reach. Kirito! Asuna shouted, snapping him out of his thoughts. He steeled himself, raising his sword. Let's end this quickly, he said, his voice hardening. The corrupted players let out a distorted, inhuman screech as they charged. And the battle began. The corrupted avatars attacked without warning, their bodies jerking forward in a chaotic rush. Their limbs moved unnaturally, twitching and snapping into place like broken marionettes. Despite their grotesque, erratic movements, they were fast, faster than Kirito expected. One lunged for him, its gnarled hands reaching out, its glowing eyes flickering with a strange, hollow light. Kirito reacted instinctively, his body moving before his mind could catch up. His rapier flashed in the dim light, parrying the attack with a sharp, elegant motion, before slicing upward in a perfectly timed riposte. The corrupted avatar staggered back, its form glitching as the strike hit home. Then, with a final distorted screech, it shattered into fragments of code, dissolving into the air like dust. Whoa! Klein shouted, his katana carving through another enemy in a wide, sweeping arc. Kirito! Since when did you fight like that? Kirito didn't answer immediately. He was already moving again, his body weaving between attacks with a grace that felt completely alien. His rapier struck with precision, each thrust and parry perfectly timed, almost mechanical. I didn't learn this. He finally snapped, his voice tinged with frustration, as he deflected a blow aimed at his side. His body twisted into a seamless counterattack, the motion smooth and fluid in a way that made his skin crawl. It's Asuna's combat style. The AI must have overwritten my animations too. Another corrupted avatar came at him from the left, its limbs flailing wildly. Kirito ducked under its swing, his body pivoting effortlessly, as his blade found its mark with a quick, elegant thrust. The move was perfect. Too perfect. It wasn't his. I don't know, Sinon called out from a distance, her voice calm and steady, despite the chaos around them. She notched an arrow, and fired in one smooth motion. The glowing projectile, striking an enemy between the eyes. The corrupted avatar crumpled, glitching violently, before dissolving. You're actually pretty good at it. Maybe you should stick with it. Yeah. No thanks. Kirito shot back, sidestepping another attack. His long hair whipped around his face as he spun, momentarily obscuring his vision. He growled in irritation, shoving it back with his free hand. I can't even see with all this hair. Welcome to my world, Asuna said, a slight smirk tugging at her lips as she fought beside him. Her rapier danced through the air, her movements quick and precise. She dispatched 2 enemies in rapid succession, her strikes mirroring Kirito's almost exactly. For a moment, it was like watching 2 versions of the same fighter, one deliberate, one reluctant. Asuna glanced over at him, her expression softening. You're doing great, Kirito, she said, her voice calm but reassuring. Just try not to overthink it. Let it flow. Easy for you to say, he muttered under his breath, deflecting another attack with a flick of his wrist. His movements were flawless, but they didn't feel like his. Every step, every strike, every dodge. It was like his body was on autopilot, following a script he didn't write. Another enemy lunged at him, and Kirito reacted without thinking, his rapier flashing in a blur of silver. The corrupted avatar froze mid-attack, its body jerking violently before shattering into fragments of code. As the pieces dissolved, he stood there for a moment, gripping his sword tightly as his chest heaved. This isn't right, he thought. This isn't how I fight. This isn't who I am. But there was no time to dwell on it. The corrupted avatars showed no signs of slowing, their distorted forms surging forward in relentless waves. Kirito, on your right, Asuna called out. He turned just in time, his rapier flashing upward to intercept an enemy's jagged blade. The impact rattled up his arm, but his body moved seamlessly into the next motion, twisting to deliver a precise counterstrike. The corrupted avatar crumbled, its fragmented remains scattering into the air. Nearby, Klein was holding his own, though his movements were far less polished. He swung his katana in wide, sweeping arcs, his strikes powerful but lacking finesse. Man, these things just keep coming, he shouted, slicing through another enemy. What? Does this AI have a whole army of zombie players or something? Looks like it, Agil rumbled, his massive axe cleaving through 2 enemies at once. Despite his size, he moved with surprising agility, his strikes deliberate and efficient. Stay focused. If we lose our rhythm, we're done. Sinon was perched on a nearby ledge, her sniper rifle picking off enemies with deadly precision. They're not just mindless, she said, her voice sharp. They're adapting, Watch their movements, they're starting to coordinate. As if to prove her point, 3 corrupted avatars suddenly rushed Kirito at once, their attacks synchronized. His heart jumped, but his body responded before his mind could process the danger. He ducked low, his rapier slashing in a wide arc that caught all 3 enemies mid-charge. The motion was smooth, almost graceful, and the enemies collapsed in unison, their forms glitching violently before disintegrating. Kirito! Asuna's voice snapped him out of his daze. He turned to see her dispatching 2 more enemies, her movements as fluid and precise as ever. She didn't even seem winded, her focus unshakable. For a moment, he envied her ease. The way she seemed so at home in this body, this combat style. But then he reminded himself, this was her style, not his. Don't get distracted, Asuna said, her tone firm but concerned. Kirito nodded, gripping his rapier tighter. I'm fine, he said, though the words felt hollow. The group fought on, their coordination slowly returning as they adjusted to the relentless assault. Klein's heavy strikes, Agile's powerful sweeps, Sinon's precise shots, and Asuna's elegant movements, all combined into a deadly rhythm. Kirito fell into step with them, his frustration simmering beneath the surface as his body continued to move on its own, following instincts that weren't his. The whispers grew louder with each enemy they defeated, the fragmented voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. They seemed to echo from the very walls around them, growing in intensity until they were almost deafening. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last corrupted avatar fell. It let out a distorted screech as it shattered, the fragments of its form dissolving into the air. The silence that followed was almost jarring, the absence of combat leaving a strange void in its wake. Kirito stood there for a moment, his chest heaving as he tried to steady his breathing. The rapier in his hand felt wrong, like a foreign object he couldn't wait to get rid of. Is it over? Klein asked, his voice breaking the silence. He leaned on his katana, sweat dripping from his brow. Please, tell me it's over. For now, Sinon said, lowering her rifle. Her sharp eyes scanned the room, still wary. But I doubt that was the last of them. Asuna stepped up beside Kirito, her expression a mix of concern and admiration. You did great, she said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. Kirito didn't respond immediately. His grip on the rapier tightened, his knuckles white. Finally, he let out a shaky breath and sheathed the blade. Let's just keep moving, he said, his voice quieter than usual. I don't want to stay here any longer than we have to. The group nodded, their silence heavy with unspoken thoughts. The whispers had stopped, but the oppressive atmosphere of the sanctuary remained. Whatever was waiting for them deeper inside. Kirito knew one thing for certain. The fight was far from over. The group stepped into the heart of the sanctuary of echoes, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to peak. The massive chamber before them was unlike anything they'd encountered. The walls pulsed with an eerie rhythmic energy, their translucent surfaces rippling with cascading lines of code. The air shimmered with a faint haze, distorting the light that radiated from the center of the room. There, suspended in midair, was the core, a glowing orb of light. It floated silently, its surface shifting and rippling like liquid silver, radiating an almost hypnotic brilliance. The orb seemed alive, its glow pulsing in time with the hum of the chamber. The energy it emanated was palpable, pressing against their skin like static electricity. Kirito's gaze locked onto the orb, his jaw tightening. He didn't know what he'd expected, but the sight of it made his stomach churn. It wasn't just a piece of code. It felt sentient, aware, watching. "That's it," Agil said, his deep voice breaking the tension. His grip tightened on his axe as he scanned the chamber. The AI. The orb pulsed, and a smooth, emotionless voice filled the room. It wasn't loud, but it seemed to echo from all directions, resonating in their bones. "Greetings, intruders," the AI said, its tone calm and unnervingly neutral. "You have reached the core of the preservation protocol." Preservation protocol? Asuna stepped forward, her rapier glinting faintly in the swirling light. Her voice was steady, but there was a sharp edge to it. "What are you preserving?" The orb shimmered, its glow intensifying. When it spoke again, there was no inflection in its voice, yet the words carried a disturbing weight. "The essence of subject, Asuna," it said. "Hair data is invaluable. It must be preserved at all costs." Kirito's fists clenched at his side. His pulse quickened, and a sense of dread crept over him. "What does that have to do with me?" he demanded, his voice hard. The orb shifted, its surface rippling like disturbed water as it glowed brighter. "Subject. Kirito was selected as the optimal backup for subject. Asuna's data," the AI replied, its tone as calm as ever. "Your compatibility is ideal. The replication process is nearly complete." The words hit Kirito like a punch to the gut. For a moment, he couldn't speak, his mind racing to process what he'd just heard. "Backup?" "Oh," Klein said, his voice breaking the silence. His jaw dropped, and he gestured wildly at Kirito. "You're saying Kirito is... what? A spare copy of Asuna? Like some kind of digital clone?" Kirito's hands trembled, his nails digging into his palms. He took a step forward, his voice rising with outrage. "I'm not a backup. I'm my own person." The AI ignored his outburst, its glow intensifying as it continued in the same detached tone. "The replication ensures the survival of subject, Asuna's essence. Any interference will be eliminated." "So, that's it," Sinan said, her voice sharp and laced with anger. Her sniper rifle was already raised, her finger hovering over the trigger. "You're rewriting Kirito's data just to protect Asuna? You're destroying it to make a backup?" "Correct," the AI replied without hesitation. "The process is irreversible. Subject. Kirito is now the backup version of subject, Asuna. The original will remain intact, while the backup ensures redundancy." Kirito's blood boiled, his heart pounding in his chest. His voice cracked as he shouted, "I'm not some redundancy. I'm not Asuna. I'm not your backup. Stop this now." The orb pulsed in response, its light growing brighter with every word. When it spoke again, its voice was colder, more mechanical. "Interference detected," it said. "Initiating protocol defense." The chamber trembled, the ground beneath their feet vibrating violently as the walls began to shift. The swirling light in the center of the room coalesced, its glowing strands converging and twisting together. Slowly, the energy began to take shape, solidifying into a massive humanoid form. The figure stood tall, towering over the group, with an imposing presence. Its body was composed entirely of shimmering light, its surface rippling and shifting, like liquid energy. Its movements were smooth, almost unnaturally so, and its glowing eyes locked onto them, with an unfeeling, analytical gaze. The AI's voice echoed one last time, colder and more final than before. Eliminate all threats to the preservation protocol. The figure moved with startling speed, its massive arm lashing out in a sweeping motion. The group scattered, barely avoiding the strike as it slammed into the ground, sending a shockwave rippling through the chamber. Kirito rolled to his feet, his heart racing. He tightened his grip on his rapier, glaring up at the glowing figure. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, fear, frustration, all crashing together in a storm he couldn't control. "This thing thinks it can just rewrite me," he muttered under his breath, his voice trembling with rage. "That it can just turn me into some backup copy?" "Kirito, focus!" Asuna shouted, her voice cutting through his thought. She darted forward, her rapier striking the figure's leg, in a quick, precise motion. The blade connected, but the energy around the figure's body rippled, deflecting the attack. "It's got some kind of shield," Asuna called out, jumping back as the figure's massive arm swept toward her. "Figures," Klein muttered, gripping his katana tightly. He glanced at Agil. "Any ideas, big guy?" Agil studied the figure, his brow furrowed. "Its core is still in the center of the room," he said, nodding toward the glowing orb that hovered behind the figure. "That's the real target. This thing is just a defense mechanism." "Easier said than done," Sinon shouted from the back, her sniper rifle firing off a glowing projectile. The shot struck the figure's shoulder, but the energy absorbed it with barely a flicker. "It's like shooting at a wall." Kirito's grip on his rapier tightened, his anger bubbling over. "Fine," he said, through gritted teeth. "Then we take down the wall." He darted forward, his body moving with unnatural speed and precision. His rapier flashed, striking at the figure's arm in a flurry of quick, elegant strikes. Each hit sent ripples through the energy, but the figure didn't falter, its glowing eyes fixed on him. "Kirito, don't get reckless," Asuna shouted, rushing to his side. "I'm not going to let this thing decide who I am." Kirito shot back, his voice filled with defiance. The figure's arm lashed out, forcing both of them to dodge. Asuna caught Kirito's eye, her expression a mix of determination and concern. "We'll stop it," she said firmly. "Together." Kirito nodded, his anger giving way to resolve. He glanced back at the others. "We need to distract it long enough to hit the core. Sinon, can you get a shot?" "If you can keep it busy, maybe," Sinon replied, already moving into position. "On it," Agil said, charging forward with a roar. His massive axe slammed into the figure's leg, drawing its attention. "Let's go," Kirito shouted, his heart pounding as the battle began in earnest. The group drew their weapons, the weight of the moment pressing down on them like a physical force. The air in the chamber seemed to vibrate with energy, each pulse of the eye's glowing form sending ripples through the room. The light from the core cast long flickering shadows across their faces, amplifying the unease that hung in the air. Kirito's grip tightened on his rapier, the hilt slick against his palm. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, each beat like a drum echoing in his ears. His mind raced, but he forced himself to breathe, to focus. This wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight for who he was, for what he was. He glanced at Asuna beside him. Her rapier was already poised, her stance steady and confident despite the storm they were about to face. The flickering light of the eye's core reflected in her eyes. But there was no fear there, only determination. She caught his gaze and gave him a firm nod. "Stay focused," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "We can do this." Kirito swallowed hard, forcing down the knot of anxiety in his throat. He nodded back, his voice steady, despite the chaos brewing inside him. "Let's finish this." But even as he said the words, doubt clawed at the edges of his mind. Could they really finish this? Could they defeat an enemy that wasn't just stronger than them, but smarter? An entity that had rewritten the very code of his existence? His thoughts were interrupted as the AI's avatar shifted. The towering humanoid figure of energy stood motionless for a moment, its glowing eyes scanning them like a predator assessing its prey. Then it moved. The AI lunged forward with terrifying speed, its massive body distorting and reforming as it charged. The ground beneath their feet trembled with the force of its movements, and the air filled with a sharp, electric hum that made Kirito's teeth ache. "Scatter!" Asuna shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. The group moved as one, each of them darting in a different direction to avoid the AI's attack. Its glowing arm slammed into the ground where they had been standing, the impact sending out a shockwave that rippled through the chamber. Kirito rolled to his feet, his heart racing. The AI's sheer size and speed were overwhelming, but he couldn't let it intimidate him. He couldn't afford to hesitate. "Kirito, watch out!" Sinan's voice rang out from across the room. He turned just in time to see the AI's other arm sweeping toward him like a massive, glowing blade. He barely managed to dodge, his body twisting instinctively as the attack grazed past him. The energy crackled against his armor, and he felt a sharp, burning sensation along his side. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, gritting his teeth against the pain. Asuna was already on the offensive, her rapier flashing as she darted toward the AI's leg. She struck with precision, her blade aimed at the glowing energy that seemed to pulse like veins along its form. The impact sent a ripple through the AI's body, but it didn't falter. "It's shielding itself," she called out, jumping back as the AI's arm came down in a crushing arc. "We've got to break through that shield," Agil shouted, his massive axe swinging in a wide arc as he aimed for the same spot Asuna had struck. The force of his attack sent a visible shockwave through the AI's leg, but the glowing energy absorbed the blow. "It's too strong," Klein yelled, narrowly, dodging a strike that would have taken his head off. He stumbled back, his katana raised defensively. "How are we supposed to hit something that just eats our attacks? We need to distract it," Sinan said, her sharp eyes locked on the AI's core as she moved into position. Her sniper rifle glowed faintly as she notched another shot. "Its core's exposed when it attacks. Keep it busy, and I'll take the shot." "Easier said than done," Klein retorted, slashing wildly at one of the AI's arms as it swung toward him. Kirito's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the chaos unfolding around him. Every move he made felt mechanical, his body responding with an elegance that wasn't his own. Even now, as he dodged and struck, he could feel the AI's influence in every motion, every instinct. "This isn't me," he thought, his frustration boiling over. "I'm not just a puppet. I can fight my own way." But, even as the thought crossed his mind, the AI's voice echoed through the chamber, cold and unfeeling. "Resistance is futile," it said, its glowing form shifting as it prepared another attack. "The replication process is nearly complete. Subject: Kirito will be overwritten. Subject: Asuna's essence will be preserved." Kirito's blood ran cold at the words. He could feel the AI's presence inside him, like a shadow creeping through his mind. It wasn't just rewriting his code, it was trying to erase him. "No!" he shouted, his voice filled with defiance. His rapier flashed as he charged forward, his movements faster and more precise than ever. He struck at the AI with everything he had, pouring all his anger and fear into each blow. The ice shield absorbed the strikes, but the force of his attack sent ripples through its form. For a moment, its movements faltered, and its glowing eyes locked onto him. "You will comply," it said, its voice echoing in his mind as much as in the room. "The replication is inevitable." "Like hell it is," Kirito shouted, his voice trembling with rage. "Kirito, fall back," Asuna called out, her voice laced with urgency. He barely had time to move before the AI's arm came down again, the impact creating a shockwave that sent him sprawling. He hit the ground hard, his rapier skittering out of his grasp. "Kirito." Azuna's voice was sharp with panic as she darted toward him, her rapier raised to cover his retreat. Kirito scrambled to his feet, his chest heaving. The eye's glowing form loomed over them, its energy pulsing with a menacing light. "Target compromised," the AI said, its voice colder than ever. "Initiating final phase of preservation. Protocol." The chamber began to tremble, the walls rippling as new streams of code cascaded down their surfaces. The energy in the room grew overwhelming, the light from the core intensifying until it was almost blinding. Kirito's heart pounded as he gripped his rapier once more, forcing himself to stand. He glanced at Asuna, who was already moving into position, her determination unwavering. "This is it," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "We stop it here." Kirito nodded, his grip tightening on his weapon. "No matter what it takes." The eye's glowing form began to shift again, its energy coalescing into a new, even more menacing shape. The ground beneath them cracked, and the chamber seemed to darken as the light from the core flared one last time. And then, the AI attacked.